Madison, Alex, and Jackson, a trio of teenagers known for their carefree attitude, gathered at the corner of their neighborhood street. The day was bright, and their laughter echoed as they joked about Mrs. Dolores, an elderly woman who lived alone. Known for her stories and wisdom, she was often seen tending to her garden or reading on her porch. The three friends, all confident and brimming with youthful energy, decided it would be amusing to visit her. "Let's go see Mrs. Dolores," Madison suggested, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "We can bring some snacks and a camera. It'll be like an adventure." Alex chuckled, flipping his phone in his hand. "Yeah, we can show everyone at school how we hung out with the old lady. Might even go viral." Jackson, the quiet one of the group, nodded, although a bit reluctantly. She probably has some wild stories. As they planned their visit, treating Mrs. Dolores as an amusement rather than a person, they failed to recognize the insensitivity of their intentions. They were unaware of the impact this decision would soon have on their lives. The trio approached Mrs. Dolores's house, a quaint, well-maintained home with a vibrant garden out front. Their bravado wavered slightly as they neared the door, the reality of their actions slowly sinking in. Jackson knocked on the door, his phone camera ready. Mrs. Dolores opened the door with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was shorter than they expected, with silver hair pulled back neatly and a gentle demeanor. Her dark skin was marked with the passage of time, yet her posture exuded strength. "Hello, children," she greeted them, her voice steady. "What brings you here today?" The teenagers exchanged nervous glances. "We brought you some snacks," Madison blurted out, holding up a bag of chips. The awkwardness was palpable. Mrs. Dolores's eyes twinkled, seeing through their charade. "How kind of you. Why don't you come in and we can share them?" As they stepped inside, the teens felt a shift in the atmosphere. Mrs. Dolores's home was filled with photographs and mementos, each telling a story they hadn't considered. The initial excitement they felt turned into an uneasy silence as they realized they were in the presence of something deeper than they had anticipated. The living room was cozy, filled with the scent of freshly baked cookies. Mrs. Dolores placed a plate of homemade treats on the coffee table. "These are much better than those store-bought ones," she said with a wink. The trio hesitated before taking a cookie. As they bit into the warm, soft treats, they couldn't help but relax a little. Mrs. Dolores began to speak, her voice carrying a soft but clear authority. "You know," she started, "when I was your age, life around here was very different." The teens exchanged glances, trying to stifle their laughter. Alex whispered something to Jackson, but Mrs. Dolores continued, unfazed. "We didn't have the freedoms you have now," she explained, her eyes distant as if reliving the memories. "Simple things like going to the movies or sitting at the same lunch counter weren't possible for everyone." Madison, uncomfortable with the serious tone, tried to lighten the mood. "At least you didn't have to deal with bad movie sequels, right?" Mrs. Dolores' gaze sharpened, fixing on Madison. "Young lady, every laugh has a price, and the truth is often painful. Are you prepared to hear it?" The room fell silent, the teenagers' smirks fading as they realized the gravity of her words. Alex, feeling the weight of the moment, leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean, Mrs. Dolores? What happened back then?" Mrs. Dolores took a deep breath, straightening in her chair. "Let me tell you about growing up in a time of segregation. It wasn't just about separate water fountains or seats on the bus. It was about dignity, about being seen as human." As she began her story, the teenagers found themselves drawn in, their initial plans forgotten. They listened for the first time, with genuine interest as Mrs. Dolores painted a vivid picture of a world they had only read about in history books. Her voice trembled slightly as she recounted a pivotal moment from her childhood. "I was just 10 years old when I first understood what it meant to be different in the eyes of society," she began, her gaze distant. Jackson, Alex, and Madison leaned in, their earlier mockery forgotten as they sensed the seriousness of her words. "It was my first day at a newly integrated school," she continued. "I walked in, proud in my new dress, only to be met with stares and whispers. A boy spat at my feet and called me a name I won't repeat, The teacher did nothing, just looked away. Alex shifted uncomfortably, suddenly reminded of his own grandmother, whom he'd never asked about her past. A knot of guilt formed in his stomach. Mrs. Dolores continued, her voice growing stronger. I went home crying that day, but my mother told me to hold my head high. You're paving the way for others, she said. I didn't understand then, but I do now. Madison, struggling with her emotions, blurted out, but that was a long time ago. Things are different now, right? Mrs. Dolores fixed her with a piercing look. Would you feel the same way if you were in my shoes, Madison? If you were spat on and called names just for the color of your skin? The room fell silent, Madison's mouth opening and closing with no words coming out. Jackson looked at the floor, his cheeks flushed with shame, and Alex stared at Mrs. Dolores, really seeing her for the first time. In that moment, the gap between their worlds seemed both vast and surprisingly small. The teenagers grappled with emotions they hadn't expected: discomfort, guilt, and the first stirrings of understanding. Mrs. Dolores took a deep breath, her gaze softening as she looked at the teenagers before her. She could see the confusion and guilt in their eyes, emotions they were not accustomed to grappling with. She decided to share something more personal, something that might help them understand. You know, I didn't always live here, she began, her voice gentle. I grew up in the South, where the air was thick with heat and tension. My father was a carpenter, and my mother was a teacher. They were strong people, but they were always afraid. Afraid for me and my siblings. Afraid of what the world could do to us. Jackson, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. But Mrs. Dolores, you don't seem afraid now. A small, sad smile touched her lips. No, child, I'm not afraid anymore. But that took many years and many painful lessons. She paused, her eyes drifting to a photograph on the wall. It showed a younger version of herself, standing next to a man with a warm smile and kind eyes. That's my late husband, Henry, she said, her voice softening with affection. We met at a civil rights rally. He was a fighter, always standing up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. The teenagers looked at the photo, seeing the love and strength in their smiles. It was a side of Mrs. Dolores they hadn't expected, one that made her seem more real, more human. He was arrested many times for his activism, she continued, but he never wavered. He taught me that our worth isn't defined by how others see us, but by how we see ourselves. Alex shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of her words. What happened to him? He asked quietly. Mrs. Dolores' smile faded slightly. He passed away a few years ago. Cancer. But he left behind a legacy of courage and compassion. Madison, who had been struggling with her feelings, finally spoke up. Mrs. Dolores, we didn't mean to make fun of you. We didn't know. The older woman nodded, her eyes kind. I know, child. You're young, and the world seems so big and full of possibilities. But it's important to remember that everyone you meet has a story, a history that shapes who they are. Jackson, feeling the need to say something, added, I think we came here for the wrong reasons, but I'm glad we did. You've taught us something important today. Mrs. Dolores smiled warmly. That's all I can ask for. Life is full of lessons, and sometimes they come from the most unexpected places. The three teenagers sat in silence for a moment, absorbing everything they had heard. The air in the room was thick with unspoken thoughts, a mix of regret and newfound respect. Finally, Alex broke the silence. Mrs. Dolores, would you mind if we came back sometime? Not to make fun, but to really listen to your stories? Her eyes sparkled with warmth. I'd like that very much. My door is always open to those who are willing to learn. As they left her home, the trio walked down the street with a quieter demeanor than before. The bravado and careless laughter had been replaced with a sense of introspection. They didn't speak much, each lost in their own thoughts, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. The experience at Mrs. Dolores's house marked a turning point for the teenagers. They began to see the world differently, with a deeper appreciation for the lives and struggles of others. They returned to Mrs. Dolores's home many times after that day, Not to mock, but to listen, to learn, and to grow. And as the seasons changed, so did they, shedding the carelessness of youth and stepping into a more thoughtful, compassionate understanding of the world around them. Mrs. Dolores's stories became a cherished part of their lives, a reminder that every person carries a piece of history worth respecting and remembering. In the end, they realized that the adventure they had set out on was not about finding amusement, but about discovering the richness of life through the eyes of someone who had lived it fully.